Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is a surprise, isn't it? The idea that Jack D was at the bar. I'd assumed he was home alone. So based on what we know, we can theorize that Maddie told Adam, the bartender, possibly the guy sitting in the corner middle right, told him everything, and when the girls left, likely shortly after this footage was recorded, Adam told Jack something about that everything stuff. Meanwhile, Hoodie Guy was chaperoning the girls home, and if Hoodie Guy knew Jack was once an item, but now out of the picture, perhaps he thought he had his foot in the door. And perhaps he did, until Kaylee became concerned about Jack finding out about something during the walk to the food truck, and instead wanted to do some damage control rather than get cozy with anyone. Except in front of the food truck, Kaylee doesn't seem to be in a damage control mode. She doesn't seem to be paying any attention to Hoodie Guy either. Unless what is going on is some of those furtive finger movements on her phone. Were they to tell Jack something, possibly on social media? Was that Adam telling her something, possibly on social media? We do know an hour after the corner cafe footage was recorded, Kaylee and Maddie began sending frantic texts and calling Jack. I think it started at 2:26 in the morning. Are we really supposed to believe that Adam told Jack something, not very flattering, about one or both of the girls that night? Jack then took his knife and did something terrible, arrived back home, and Adam was none the wiser. Also, if Jack drove an Elantra to the crime scene and back, which seems unlikely, but if he did, wouldn't it be a simple enough matter to say, that's what happened? There's an Elantra parked in the parking lot of this or that fraternity, and it belongs to XYZ. Once again, we really do need to know the context of that everything. But can you see, even if Adam said something that was extremely upsetting or triggering to Jack, if Jack responded, Adam would know. If it were that simple, if it were that obvious, wouldn't we have had an arrest ages ago? So if that is not the scenario, what is another scenario? What does this footage tell us? How does it take us into a new direction? How does it start to answer some of the many questions we are having regarding this mystery? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind there's also a Patreon channel at patreon.com/TCRS where long-time members discuss cases just like this. There's also some additional analysis there. To the many thousands of you who have subscribed recently to this channel, welcome to the most authentic voice in true crime. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So, almost 7 weeks after a quadruple murder rocked Moscow, Idaho, without a suspect being named, this image suddenly appeared on Reddit. Moscow PD are aware of the image, but Captain Anthony Darlinger has declined to verify its authenticity. So, by inference, Moscow PD aren't saying whether it's a credible image. They also won't answer any questions about who it depicts. So that's according to what Darlinger told Fox News. What's also clear is that the source of the image is both hidden and remains unclear. Who got hold of this image, from whom, how, we don't know. According to Fox News, quote, social media comments have run wild with speculation about whom the photo shows, along with the duo believed to be Gonzalez and Mogan. In this analysis, I'll be providing my assessment on the authenticity of this image, which I think is kind of being glossed over by a lot of creators and other people. I think we need to spend a little bit more time just first establishing, is this authentic? And then we're going to look at some additional context and see where that takes us. Didn't Jack say he was in bed sleeping on the night of the murders? Does this image prove that that is not true, or is there something about this image that is in itself problematic? In other words, it doesn't really prove anything. If the image is fake, then it doesn't say anything about the events anyway. We are also going to look at a potential new theory which arises based on accepting the image at face value. So let's begin with context. As a primer, what's the first thing we need to do before we do any further analysis? Well, we need to check whether the image is real. Is it authentic? Well, how do we do that? Well, you can start off by doing the face value test. Does it look authentic? On the one hand, Kaylee and Maddie are dressed the way they did early in the morning of November 13th. And for that matter, so is Hoodie Guy. He looks like he was dressed that night, that morning. Also, all three of these figures are relatively sharp focus. You can see them fairly clearly. You don't get a sense that they could be interchangeable with any three other individuals. We can see not only their clothing, footwear, and headgear quite clearly, we can even see the subtle colors of Kaylee's outfit, contrasting with the wheat blonde of her hair. You can see there's a very slight blue to her jeans. She seems to be wearing kind of a gray hoodie or something, and then you can tell that her blonde hair is a slightly different color to what she's wearing. So do you agree, at face value, the image seems plausible, and that has been enough for most people? But if we want to be fussy, if we start scratching a little and digging around, although Kaylee's brightly lit up, Kaylee's shadow seems to be missing. Maddie has a shadow going in one direction, away from the viewer, but Kaylee doesn't. Where's her shadow? Why isn't it moving in the same direction as Maddie's? At face value, none of this seems terribly significant. There could be multiple light sources as well, right? So what we see within the footage appears to be pretty decent. And the Reddit post also uses the word appears, which is quite interesting. Despite being the actual source of the leak, which appears, well, it assumes that someone knew where it came from. And yet they're still saying that it appears. But this I don't like. Have a look at the oversized zero in the in the clock that is dealing with this screen grab. The oversized zero is the sixth number from the right. Now compare that zero to the 3 digits to the left of it in 2022. The slash and first 2 in 2022 also look slightly crooked when compared to the other slash and 2. Also, compare the size of the first 3 on the left in 13 to the 2 right next to it in 2022. In other words, the very thing that confirms the importance of the video, the time and the date, seems a little problematic. In digital recordings, you can sometimes get distortions from ambient light and movement, especially nocturnal or low light footage, but that's not the case here. There ought not to be any distortions in the number size of the clock. Now we're going to come back to issues of authenticity as we deal with a new theory that arises from this footage, if we assume it to be authentic. But let's dig a little deeper, scratch a little further, and in order to do that, let's go into intertextuality. What is intertextual to this particular screen grab? Well, about 4 hours before the Corner Club leak came onto our radar at TCRS, we were dealing with Banfield's interview with a certain Chris Hall, a cyber sleuth that appeared to have identified a third sighting of the Elantra. Well, do you think that was credible? Do you think that was a third sighting? And I actually polled you guys, I think, on my community page on YouTube. Only 1/5 of you said that it's definitely a third sighting of the Elantra. 26% said no, it's not, definitively, and more than half said, you know what, I just don't know. So that was going on in the prelude to the anonymous leak of this particular image. On any given Sunday, this would be a hugely significant dot to join to the other two. I'm talking about the Elantra stuff. And of course, this Corner Club footage, even more significant. Right? And anyway, if we go back to the Elantra thing, Hall's research made sense, the timing made sense, the thought process made sense, all of it made sense. But at TCRS, there's been consensus that the footage isn't ultimately convincing. Various reasons have been given, but I think the most obvious reason is that the vehicle in question is very clearly not white. So what are we dealing with here? What are we dealing with when you are looking at footage? It's actual video, actual screen grabs. You can actually see the vehicle, and you cannot actually tell, apparently, whether something is white or not white. So what we're dealing with is the all too human weakness where what we see with our own eyes is overridden both by what we think and what we want to see. Is that a white vehicle? Well, it doesn't appear to be white, but because I very strongly want it to be white, it is white. Ironically, while this is going on, this discussion about this vehicle, I was dealing with elements of magical thinking in Maddie Mogan's Pinterest. And while researching Maddie's interest in the law of attraction, we discussed a concept we all know but don't necessarily know it has been given a name. It's apophenia. Apophenia is finding meaning and connections in things that are actually unrelated. Well, isn't that what's going on here? Isn't that what's going on with the Elantra? Hasn't there been a lot of apophenia related to the Elantra? Could it be this? Could it be that? And so what about this footage inside the Corner Club? Is that apophenia as well? Is that contrived to take advantage of our tendency, our weakness to apophenia, trying to find meaning and connections when they aren't actually there? The definition of apophenia is the tendency to perceive a connection of meaningful pattern between unrelated or random things, such as objects or ideas. Now, as a writer of dozens of books on true crime, what you're always trying to do is find the real pattern, not any pattern, but the golden thread of truth, the authentic pattern hidden within all the other patterns. You can't simply find a pattern and stop there and say, hey, I've got it. You've got to decipher all the patterns and have the discernment to tell the fool's gold pattern from the real stuff. Because let's face it, there is deliberately made fake information in true crime that is created by people that are spectators and part of the cottage industry. Then there are also, to some extent, misdirection patterns that are part of what the criminal himself puts in place, covering things up and those distortions. And then there are simply just misinterpretations. You've got to wade through all of that stuff, the deliberate pageantry and the accidental inferences. Also, someone makes a mistake or misspeaks, and someone then takes that up as gospel and becomes something. You've got to go through all of that stuff and make sure of your sources and make sure of your story. In my experience, upwards of 90% of true crime content on social media is apophenia. So the next time you click on a video, consider the fact that there's, certainly in my opinion, a 90% chance that this is really rubbish. That it sounds really interesting and it looks like there's a connection, but is there? We're always aggregating patterns, right, in true crime, but most of it is actually meaningless. The question is, in this case, in this episode, is this image a real workable configuration or isn't it? Well, what do you think? If 90% of true crime content on social media is apophenia, do you think this is part of the 10% that isn't? No, really, what do you think? Do you think this is an exception to that rule? Now, one way to stare at that image and figure out what's really going on is to not look at it. Yeah, you heard that right. To examine the fabric from which it emerged instead of the fabric itself. So you want to look at the context, the intertextuality in terms of the content timeline of this case and see how that appears. And very few people are willing to do that because that really amounts to introspection, to looking at how we are seeing things and within what context we are making connections. As mentioned, shortly after a YouTuber appeared on Banfield espousing a promising but ultimately dubious lead, this Corner Club screen grab appeared hot on its heels. But why one image and not several? Why not something showing the face of the disputed figure the girls are talking to more clearly? If there was video footage, and this clearly is from CCTV, then there must be a moment where the figures in front of that face sort of open up to some extent and provide clear line of sight. So why don't we see that? Well, if someone was manufacturing an image trying to mischievously trying to suggest that Jack was somewhere when he wasn't actually there, they could be in legal trouble. But what if you suggested that you're seeing someone and there's sort of a question mark there? Well, then there's a little bit of leeway, isn't there? So the other thing is, besides why not showing the rest of the clip and the figures actually moving, contextually, we are also dealing with a doldrum period in terms of announcements from Moscow PD. We haven't really heard anything from them, or any other interviews or news while demand for news is at a peak. Actually, that's not totally true. Moscow PD have responded very recently, a couple of hours ago, to this particular image. I'll get to that in a moment. Now, in my experience, when an incredible breakthrough that seems too good to be true emerges, not in the mainstream media, not from law enforcement, but through social media, sort of when creators need it the most, well, it is because it's too good to be true. In other words, something that's too good to be true is likely fake. We saw the same thing in the Kylie Rodney case when time-stamped party footage from the Prosser Lake campground emerged, only for it to be exposed as fake footage from somewhere else that someone had mischievously mislabeled in order to make it seem to be something that it wasn't. The label was the biggest clue to what it was, but also the biggest clue to what it wasn't. And of course, social media doesn't really care about that because they can cash in their chips long before something like this is found out to be fake. And let's face it, fake videos or saying that something's fake or debunking something is far less popular than the, oh my God, I can't believe what I'm actually seeing here, this is incredible video. So that's all familiar territory to us in true crime. Now, it's also not as though faking footage is below the ethics of the true crime community. We've seen it so many times before. In fact, this case, this Idaho student murders case, started with a hoaxer claiming right off the bat that he had evidence that the victims were hogtied. And then, despite the cops specifically referring to that and saying that that wasn't the case, the very same hoaxer then claimed after that he had a recording of a scream. And then that was disproved as well. So in the same way, when a big breakthrough emerges on Reddit and hardly any mainstream media touch it or talk about it, you've got to wonder, if it's such breakthrough evidence, why not hand it over to the media? Instead of social media and Reddit, why not hand it over to the media where everyone can see it? Well, because the media actually have to vet this sort of information. You may not think so, but they do. And Fox News they've tried to vet this information, but as soon as they do that, what happens? Well, it dilutes the potential value when through that vetting it becomes, let's say, unclear what it really is. And when you read the Fox News article dealing with that, that's the kind of sense you get. It's like, you know what, it could be, but maybe not. Whereas you get something totally unambiguous, something absolutely certain on social media, which also furthers that whole idea that a certain person is definitively the murderer. You don't realize it, but this is all causing more slanderous and defamatory statements. So, who is the most important figure in the screen grab? If we look at it at face value, who is the most important figure? Who do we think it is, but the face is obscured just enough not to be absolutely certain? Now, in a general sense, one has to ask, is the entire image fake or just elements of it? And I guess one way to decide whether it's fake is you can go and look at the inside of the corner club. What does it look like? What does the floor look like? Now, in an update provided by Moscow PD just a few hours ago, in other words, possibly in response to this Corner Club image, they refer in their second bullet point to altered digital images and that they can't verify anything that hasn't been released through official public records requests. What do you think that tells you? That there is this idea of something being altered, and there is the issue that they can't verify it. Do you think that worries social media at all? Let's put this another way. Imagine if law enforcement had this footage to begin with, and you would imagine they would. It's the Corner Club's CCTV after all. So if they had it, and if it was obvious what had happened, then why are we 7 weeks later in this quote-unquote mysterious situation? So let's face it, this footage of the inside of the Corner Club at a particular time, let's face it, it's emerged outside of official channels, but within the context of other channels applying for footage, such as Truth and Transparency, and they've actually just gotten footage from a second noise complaint from September 2nd, featuring Xana Kernodle at the front door. So within the context of all of these creators competing to tell the narrative, some of them going to a lot more effort and actually getting hold of this really valuable footage, and it is footage related to Ali. Isn't there a temptation to manufacture evidence if you can't get hold of that evidence? Now, what's also interesting in the screen grab is that you can virtually not see any faces clearly. If you wanted to verify the image with people who were actually there, how could you do that? So the TCRS assessment of this image is that the central circle suggesting A, that Jack was at the Corner Club, and B, that Jack was at the Corner Club talking to the girls just before they left, in other words at 1:32 a.m., is false. In other words, the image is false. This seems to be common sense simply because you would have expected that to have emerged in the narrative by now. Joe, right, beard guy, never mentioned Jack, and you would imagine if the girls were sort of chatting to him until right at the end, that would be a factor. That would be something that we would all know. If it was so simple that Jack was there until the last moment, and then Adam told him something and Jack promptly went up the hill to kill Jill, this case would have been solved more than 40 days ago. Social media wants to believe it's all incredibly simple, and a single fragment picked up somewhere breaks the case, and naturally they have that fragment. They have the key. Nobody else does. And they just can't say where they got it from or how, just that it appears to be something. No, it appears to be apophenia. Apophenia is something that is linked to creativity, not analysis. And it's also linked to people who are prone to fantasy, people who like to daydream. According to the psychology, they say that that apophenia is and intelligence are actually inversely related. By the way, the term apophenia was coined by German neurologist and psychiatrist Klaus Conrad. It literally means unmotivated seeing of connections. In other words, you're seeing a connection, but you can't really motivate scientifically any connection to these connections. And so basically what this involves is the fact that we like finding patterns in randomness, but whether there are actually those patterns or there are actually real connections is another question entirely. So now I want to deal with something else. I want to deal with scenario building. The scenario that this apparent scenario appears to present is nevertheless sound in its emotional intelligence, certainly at face value. And I mean that in the sense that you would imagine someone who had an encounter with the girls that night, a close encounter, someone who spoke to them that night, or someone who expected to have a particular kind of encounter but didn't, would become a logical suspect, someone who brushed shoulders with them. Now, Jack has been the favored pinata on social media since day one, and those final, apparently frantic calls and texts to Jack, as well as what seems to be a flimsy alibi that he was sleeping, that is all driving the narrative in a particular direction. But are we applying critical thinking to this? I mean, Jack appearing at the corner club and basically being at the center of a conversation with Maddie and Kaylee doesn't actually make sense. I mean, in a scenario like that, you would almost imagine that Jack and Kaylee were getting back together or had gotten back together, not that what we know that they'd broken up 3 weeks earlier. And if anything, what Kaylee seems to be communicating in her texts was that she still wants to see him and that he should come over and that he shouldn't be a stranger because they share a dog together. In other words, this footage almost contradicts this idea of Jack as someone who's sort of on the out, lonely, sitting at home, sulking, miserable. Well, actually, no, he's out like everybody else. In fact, he's actually out later than everybody else. So he seems to be quite socialized, right? Now, again, that doesn't sound like the sort of communication you would send to someone you just saw an hour ago. You know, you should come over, don't be a stranger. Well, he's not a stranger. You saw him a few minutes ago. And if those texts were about what Adam said, you'd imagine they would also refer to Adam. That Kaylee's sister would say, you know what, a friend of his was mentioned there. That isn't mentioned at all. I also think focusing on one Jack misses the other Jack. I think focusing on one tree in the woods means you miss out on the other tree and you get a distorted sense of the entire woods. If one Jack is there, well, another Jack is with them later in the evening. And we can see in the footage that Jack, well, he's not pleased to be ditched. This, I think, is an analogy for any number of Jacks that found themselves caught up in Maddie's or Kaylee's funhouse fairy tale, only to have the door slammed in their face when it came down to it. It could even be a situation that there was some Jack who was interested in B or D, one of the surviving roommates, but in some way one of the other victims told this particular person to never come back to the house. So it could be someone who doesn't have a good relationship with them but was instead banned from the house during perhaps a noise complaint or something. And so their gripe isn't with the survivors, but with the victims for excluding them, for spoiling the fun. So in a very general sense, in a woods sense, a forest sense, all the kids inside the funhouse are pretty. All the kids are sexy. All of them are fun. And I guess regarded as cool by their peers. You would imagine and you would kind of get a sense that you would want to be part of this party, right? There are hot girls there and I want to be part of that, right? As a girl or a guy, right? And so if you are, then you're also regarded as good looking, sexy, fun, and cool by your peers. And you would imagine when B and D wanted to become residents, there was a sense that, well, you know what, we only want pretty partying girls here. So what happens when you're not wanted within that context? What if someone wanted to move into that house and they were not allowed to? They were not allowed to become residents because they didn't look right. They weren't of the right social status. And if that was the case, well, isn't the message that you're not pretty, you're not cool, you're not good enough, and you don't deserve this? We do, you don't. How do you think that feels? It is a valid argument to say millions of people break up or are rejected without it leading to murder. Absolutely true. But there are also dozens, hundreds, thousands of murders where exactly that is the case. The Jodi Arias case, Chris Watts, Patrick Frazee, Rosalia Gall, Oscar Pistorius, the disappearance of Suzanne Morphew, the murders of J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan, the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, and the Amanda Knox case. The circumstances of all of these cases occurred within a scenario either of an old relationship ending or a new one starting, or both. And then murder is the result. It's for this reason that I think Xana and Ethan are not the primary progenitors of the criminal psychology here, but either Kaylee or Maddie. In the food truck footage, Maddie seems to be interacting with guys, and guys seem to be more focused on her than on Kaylee. And that seems to be another clue many have missed. We also know that Maddie had high standards for herself and brooked no truck with anything negative or negative energy. Someone may have interpreted this as a barrier of toxic positivity and privilege, which triggered other feelings of frustration and exclusion. So I think why this image doesn't make sense actually helps move us to a scenario that does make sense. Does that make sense? If you're not sure where I'm getting this material on potential toxic positivity and just Maddie's sort of mindset, please watch my previous video that deals with Maddie's Pinterest and her thoughts on the laws of attraction and what she felt she deserved. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.